You, Aisel, and good morning to all of you. It is truly so good to see all of you here in the house of God. This morning, we will continue on our study in the book of Genesis, Genesis chapter 18, and we'll be looking at the first 15 verses. And the topic is Sarah died laughing. How many of you ever had experienced a very good laugh? To a point when it brings tears to your eyes. I've seen grown men when I tell them a joke and they laugh until they were crying. And sometimes there are people who laugh for no reason. They laugh because they hear other people laughing. And we call that insanity. All right. I'm sorry, but it's quite infectious. Sometimes I do agree. But I was doing a bit of research, and there are rare cases of people dying from laughter. It's because while they're laughing so hard, they experience a stroke, right? Or asphyxiation, meaning they couldn't breathe. It has happened, but rarely. Today, we're going to look at Sarah. She actually died laughing. And I hope you've got your Bibles with you, and I hope that you will take notes. So before we begin, let's look to God in prayer. Dear Jesus, we again want to thank you. We want to thank you that this morning we could be found in your house. We could be holding your word, the word that tells us all about you, in our hands. We just ask this morning that you help us to set aside the things that has been distracting us all this week so that we can be focused on your voice. And we ask this morning also that you open our eyes and help us to understand so that we will know you, have a very intimate relationship with you, and our lives will be changed to be like you. And truly, that's our desire. We ask this in your name and for your sake. Amen. We saw in chapter 16 how Sarah came up with a plan to help God bring about a son to inherit everything from Abraham, including the covenant. But that was Sarah's plan. And it backfired. It blew up in her face. And she ended up with a competitor, Hagar. And then a little boy called Ishmael. Ishmael wasn't bad. It wasn't his fault. But he was around. And in chapter 17, Sarah's plan failed. But in chapter 17, God rolled out his plan, his 4-part plan, which we saw in our last study. In fact, the last few studies. The 4-part plan of God, where God firstly outlined his part, his role. When he said, I will, meaning he alone will make the Abrahamic covenant happen. He will fulfill it. And then he instructed Abraham's part, that his part is to obey. And the first thing he needed to do was to get circumcised. That means his flesh must die. The old man must die. The habits, the sins. And today for us, it is equivalent to nailing it on the cross. We need to carry our cross daily and follow Jesus. And the third part was Sarah's part. For Sarah, she is to be the mother of the promised child, Isaac, all by the power of God the Holy Spirit. not by her power, not by her maneuvering and scheming. No. And God mentioned also Ishmael's part. His role is to represent all the unregenerate, all those who refuse to repent and continue on in their rebellion against God. And Ishmael represents the works of the flesh. He came about by human planning. And this type of people will multiply greatly. That's what God is saying. His people will multiply greatly. So here we have where God clearly says, I will make the Abrahamic covenant work. But on your part, even though you are now declared righteous, Abraham, but the next thing is that your old man, your flesh must die. Now that you have been saved, you do not sit around waiting for heaven, twiddling your thumbs, waiting to get to heaven. No. Meantime, while you're here on planet Earth, you are to live a life of obedience. Obedience. And firstly, the flesh must be cut off. And for Sarah, she is to be the mother of Isaac. And we're not to be like Ishmael. People who continue habitually to be in rebellion against God. That's why his name wasn't changed. And today, it is for us, God is saying, if we put Abraham and Sarah together, for us, we are already saved. Today, if you have believed in Jesus and you're born again, you are going to go to heaven. But you need to kill your old man. And then we need to reproduce, like Sarah, bringing the gospel to the world, reaching out, and also making disciples. That's our purpose here on planet Earth. That's our purpose. Question is, how are we doing? How are we doing in this area of reproducing spiritual children? Sarah was called to do it. So are we. But the big question today, the big question is, before God can use Sarah, has Sarah really died to her flesh? Has Sarah died to her old man? Or is she still at the back scheming, trying to help God? Has she died? Abraham did, because the Bible told us he believed. He believed that God will make him father of multitudes. And we saw how he has obeyed. Immediately he circumcised his whole household. All the males were circumcised. And God's blessings immediately followed. God's blessings immediately followed. Obedience always bring about God's blessing. And we can see that in the first verse of chapter 18. What was this blessing? The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. And verse 2 reads, Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Now, I must say that you need to have a sense of time, the time that has lapsed from chapter 16 to the time of chapter 18 is 12 years. Ishmael was born, and now Isaac is about to be born. So we have a time lapse of about 12 years. 12 years have passed. And one day, after being circumcised, probably a few months later after the circumcision, it takes time for them to heal. One day, as Abraham was sitting in the heat of the day in his tent, three men appeared. And the Bible tells us his tent was pitched near the great trees or the great oaks of Mamre. In the other translations, in the NASB, it says, the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. And in the Young's Literal Translation, it says, among the oaks of Mamre. By, among. So there was this cluster of oak trees which are huge and shady. That's where he pitched his tent. And we did say that whenever we read in the Bible that someone was described as sitting or living under or near a tree, it is God's way of describing his spiritual state. Is he doing well spiritually? And of course, the word oak means strong, big, and the word mamre means vigor, strength. Meaning to say, spiritually, Abraham was in a place of strength and vigor. He was doing very well. He was living a victorious life. And we did ask the question, where did all this strength come from? The strength came from the fact that he was in Hebron. Mamre was in Hebron, and the word, a related word of Hebron, is the Hebrew word hitabrut, which is fellowship, meaning bricks held tightly together. Bricks held tightly together. Abraham was in a strong place of vigor and victory because he obeyed God by circumcising all the males. And now we find Jesus visiting Abraham, accompanied by two angels, we are told in verse 2. And they came during the hottest time of the day, the noon sun, when it was supposed to be, nobody works. Everybody would be at home resting or having a nap. But here we are told that when Abraham saw the three strangers, he hurried to meet them. Now, some of you may already know that this is a Middle Eastern culture where hospitality is very important, and nobody travels in the hot sun. And today, we're going to take a quick look at some important attitudes of Abraham in the area of hospitality. Now, hospitality has nothing to do with hospital. All right, I know we send some people to hospital because we anger them that much, or we beat them up, we send them to hospital. But this is hospitality. So what are the attitudes that we can learn from Abraham? Two, which was quite obvious here. Firstly, we were told he hurried to meet them, meaning Abraham immediately got up and went out to meet them. So when we are being hospitable. We need to learn to do it immediately. Don't drag your feet. Don't even pray and say, God, what would you want me to do? God has already spoken. Just do it. He immediately got up. And then we see the second thing here, that Abraham's hospitality was also marked by humility. Humility. He bowed himself low to the ground. Verse 2 tells us, not as an act of worship, but probably it was a custom of his day. And up to this point in time, Abraham have no clue who these people are. And even if they were angels, Abraham wouldn't have bowed down to worship them. Today, sadly, we find people worshiping angels, talking to angels. Christians who does that. And that is an abomination. God does not allow that. Abraham's humility didn't stop there. We find in verses 3, 4, and 5. Let me read them to you. Verse 3. He said, if I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so that you can be refreshed and then go on your way. Now that you have come to your servant, Very well, they answered, do as you say. Notice firstly here the humility of Abraham when he called himself a servant in verses 3 and 5. And then he prepared a big feast, but he called it only a piece of bread. In some of the translation, something to eat or a piece of bread. But it was a feast. He called it a piece of bread. And then we notice that later on in verse 8, he personally served the strangers. He personally attended to them. Now we must remember that here is a man who's 99 years old. Now I hesitate to call him old man because I'm getting there. But he was really an old man, 99 years old, but wealthy. And he gave up a comfortable afternoon nap to become a servant to three strangers. Can you beat that? If I was Abraham, I would have pretended to be asleep. Or I could just tell them, hey, wait for a while. And when I'm done with my nap, but he didn't do that. Instead, the Bible tells us he ran over to meet them and pleaded with them, detained them, gave them a drink while their feet were being washed. Verses 6 and 7 tells us Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah. Quick, he said, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread. Verse 7, then he ran to the herd and selected a choice tender calf and gave it to the servant who hurried to prepare it. He was hurrying himself, he was hurrying everybody. Sarah made the bread and got his servant to make Well, I think it was a barbecue. I don't know. But notice here, he chose a choice tender calf. For me, I would have looked for probably some overnight leftovers and say, hey, it's a bit hot. Nobody's working. Would you have this? But no, he chose a calf that is the best. And then he got his servant to prepare it. So there was ample bread and the best meat. But what was most important was that he personally instructed Sarah and his servant to prepare the food. And this is truly a host that would certainly make you feel so welcome, and important. It's a nice feeling to have when you go to a house where the host is behaving like that. So when the food was ready, verse 8 tells us, he then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set this before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. While they were eating, he stood there like a servant, just waiting on them, just to see if they needed something else. Wow, that's Abraham, the servant. And we've always said we're all servants. All of us are servants, just like Jesus was a servant. And to be called a servant is not a problem. The problem starts when you are being treated like a servant. Have you ever been treated like a servant? You something in you says, shut up, shut up. Right? One day I was in a shop. I can't remember where. My t-shirt looked like the shirt of the waiter. And this guy walked up to me and said, can I have this? And then when he looked at me, oh, sorry, walked away. And I kind of gave him the dirty look, you know. Do I look like I'm a waiter here? The problem starts is when we get treated like a servant. From verse 8, there's something else quite interesting. He then brought out some curds, which is probably cheese. I don't think they have butter. Butter needs a lot of refrigeration. It's probably cheese and milk and the calf that had been prepared. Let me just make a quick mention about the Jewish dietary laws concerning milk and meat. Now, if you have been to Israel, then you will know this. Because while we were in Israel, we found out something to our horror, that when we drink our coffee at dinner time, they don't give you milk. They will never give you milk. You can ask for it. That's because of a dietary law, or sometimes we call it kosher, about having milk with meat. And we find this practice being mentioned in Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. Exodus chapter 23, verse 19. Verse 19 reads, bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. In this verse, God is saying, in your harvest, your first fruits, when you're bringing the first fruits to worship God, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. And this command was repeated again in Exodus chapter 34, verse 26, and also in Deuteronomy 14:21. Deuteronomy 14:21. And what does this verse mean? And for the longest time, I heard people explaining it this way, and I thought it was pretty acceptable. And this was how most people would explain it. That to cook a lamb in its mother's milk was considered an act of extreme cruelty because you are cooking the lamb in the very thing that was supposed to give it life. Milk was supposed to give the lamb life. And by cooking the lamb in the milk, it was an act of extreme cruelty. Now, do we still do it today? And the answer is yes. How many of you have heard of this dish called devil's curry? Few, isn't it? All right. Why was it called, or why is it still called devil's curry? And it is really banned in certain societies, but they secretly still do it, where they would use an almost full-term fetus, whether of a goat or a lamb, and then cook it in milk, curry, believing that it has special benefits. Special benefits. Now, as I've said, this explanation sounded reasonable, humane, and I'm sure the animal rights group will be very happy. But understand this wasn't the reason why God gave this command. And to understand this, we have to take a look at the context. We have always said the answer is always in the context. And three important things about interpretation of the Bible. And that is context, context, context. Look at the context. What does this verse say? This verse was speaking about the harvest time. And it was a pagan practice that during harvest time, they would take a baby goat and cook it in the mother's milk, and then sprinkle this in the harvest field, thinking that in some magical way or ways, they can make the land more fruitful next year, more abundant crop. That was their belief. But God was warning them here that they should not follow pagan practices. They should not follow pagan practices. And I personally, it's kind of for me, I don't think there's a problem with eating meat cooked in curry. But why would you have to take a fetus and they would have to go to the market? Secretly, they will sell under the counter. I saw a documentary once, it was done. And my point is this, there's so many other good things to eat. Why would you have to go to such length to eat something which has got no more value than anything else? If you have a piece of steak on your plate, I think that's fine. But the problem here is that we find that this dietary law has been over spiritualized by the rabbis. That's why today, Judaism, we call it rabbinical Judaism, that has been over spiritualized in so many ways. Not just this, but you remember the Sabbath. Probably 3 chapters. 3 chapters, God spoke about Sabbath. And they've turned it into 30 volumes. But that's the problem with rabbinical Judaism. Coming back to Abraham, he has set for us a very high standard in hospitality, that's for sure. And his attitude is definitely pleasing to God. And you and I today, we are to follow his example. But before we leave this section, let me just quickly take you through the New Testament to take a look at what Jesus and the apostles have to say about Christian hospitality. Christian hospitality. And in this day where we have got motels and hotels, we rarely have this problem with having to accommodate, to host strangers or traveling missionaries. But still, we are told in Hebrews 13 that we must not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by this some have entertained angels without knowing it. So we must do it, not because they are angels. Many of them that come through can take advantage of you, but we still do it. We still do it. So in the New Testament, we see that hospitality really is one of the requirements of an elder. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, it reads, "Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach." So it's really a calling to be hospitable. Many of you sitting here will be saying, am I glad I'm not an elder? Do you think God has forgotten about you? No. Take a look at the next one. Hospitality is a gift for all of us who are followers of Jesus. In Romans 12:13 and 1 Peter 4:9, Romans chapter 12 was speaking about gifts, our gifts. And here Paul in verse 13 said, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. And Peter went on to say, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. That actually is my hobby, grumbling. I grumble a lot, all right? Every time I need to do something good, I grumble first. And then I do it. But Peter said, don't grumble. And Paul said, it is a gift. Hospitality is a gift. And some of you, again, here, sitting here, may be saying, oh, am I glad I don't have that gift? Would you pray for it? Would you? Let me think about it. I do understand that in today's time, the period that we are living in, it is dangerous to bring in strangers, not just into your home, but even in your car, right? Today, Evelyn and I, we will hesitate to stop on a dark road and pick up a stranger. But let me say this, the hospitality can be shown in many other ways, all right? By providing food, fellowship, and help. Food, fellowship, and help. And this is what Jesus has got to say to us, that when we are showing hospitality, it is a labor of love. He said that in Matthew chapter 25, verses 34 to 40. I won't read them all, but here is where Jesus was telling this group of people that while I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. While I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And they say, Lord, since when did we do this? And Jesus replied in verse 40, the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. You did it for me. So really, this labor of love that we do, make sure that you're doing it for Jesus, not for anything else. Don't even call it for love. Love of what? Love of reputation. We love to be pat on the back. We love to be what? Praised. We like people to come and say, hey, well done, good job. Uh, uh, wow, you really love all these poor people. Then you already have your reward. But we do it because we do it for Jesus. There's another group of special people, and we find them in Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8. When we are showing hospitality, we're giving out of our own pocket. Because by doing so, we become partners with Jesus in his mission, in his ministry. We can become partners. Luke chapter 8, verses 1 to 3 tells us, in verse 1, it reads, after this, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him. Verse 2, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. And verse 3, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. They were giving out of their own savings. Did you notice something interesting about this group here? They were all women. They were all women. Not one single man was mentioned. I wonder why. And this is credit to the women. They are the people who are more sensitive to the needs of Jesus and his disciples. Such a big group. Wow. But they gave from their own savings, whatever they can. It is out of their own pocket. And the Apostle Paul sums it all up very well in Colossians chapter 3 when speaking about hospitality, that our attitude when we are serving. Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 and 24. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 and 24. Verse 23 reads, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Whether it's in church, at home, or at your workplace, remember, be the best servant you can ever be. Be the best employer that you can ever be. And you're doing it because you are serving Jesus, so that you will bring honor to his name. Let it not be said that you, being a Christian, is the laziest guy in the office, always idling, and when work comes, you ran the other way. You pretend. And I've heard people, when visitors come, they all ran to hide. And they are ready with a long list of excuses. Oh, My dog is sick. Be the best servant for Jesus. This is the standard that is required from all of us. All of us. So, as disciples of Jesus, and I hesitate even to use the word Christian, because there are some Christians who are so good at charity work, feeding the poor, that will put all of us to shame. They may call themselves Christians, but they are not disciples of Jesus. But for us who are disciples of Jesus, there are many ways and opportunities that you and I can be salt and light to the world. And let me just suggest a couple of things, and I'm sure you will know more. There are many other ways. You can invite a neighbor whom you always only wave to at a car park, to a dinner, or maybe to a sports event. Or you can bake a cake and bring it to a widow who needs your help, who needs encouragement. Open up your house to a friend, somebody you know who's going through a tough time, and give them a bed until they can get back on their feet again. I know it's tough, but you can never imagine the joy that you can receive. Evelyn and I, when we travel, we are always posted, invited to the homes of people who took real good care of us. And while people come, we take care of them. The time we spend with them, the kind of encouragement we get from them cannot be measured in terms of dollars and cents. And I would just want to add here that I'm so proud of you, that I know that there are quite a few of you who are doing this, right? Keep up the good work. This is what Jesus wants from us. And when we are doing all this, we have an opportunity to tell them about the love of Jesus, both by actions and by words. It must be both. You cannot always be giving out free food and school fees and all that without telling them about Jesus. Then what have you become? You have become nothing more than a Red Cross. We are not Red Cross. We are the cross of Jesus. So remember what Jesus is saying to us all this morning. And up to this point, there was still nothing about the appearances or the clothing of these three visitors that indicated to Abraham that they were not ordinary people. Yet, Abraham gave them the royal treatment. The royal treatment. But these three strangers didn't come for the barbecue. They were really looking for Sarah. That's why in verse 9, as we continue, verse 9 of Genesis chapter 18, verse 9 reads, "Where is your wife Sarah?" They asked him. "There, in the tent." Now again, the tent was probably pitched under a cluster of oak trees, very close to where the visitors were seated, where they were having their meal. And it was probably also a custom during that time that women do not entertain guests, and they are to remain out of sight. So having prepared the bread, Sarah now returned to her tent. And we find following verses would tell us more. Verse 10, 11, and 12. Verse 10 reads, "Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Verse 12. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? Verse 12 is important, but first, notice the position of the visitors. As they came, they came, and one of them made an announcement. He said, I will surely return to you about this time next year. And Sarah will give birth to a son. Of course, we know his name now. It's to be Isaac. And we're told Sarah was eavesdropping. Right? She was standing near the door and listening. And the person who spoke, notice in verse 10, is so important. Sarah was at the tent door, and the door was behind him. So you can imagine if this is the tent door, and the tent is that way, the tent door, and the visitor, this person who was speaking, has got his back to the door. How far, we don't really know. But it was not near. It was slight distance. Take a look at the announcement. This announcement must be very important for Jesus to come personally to Hebron, looking for Sarah, so that he can deliver the message into the ears of Sarah. And we're told here, Sarah heard it. She heard it from the tent door. But notice here also that before the message about the coming baby, Jesus said something else, something that sounded very strange. Jesus said, I will surely return to you about this time next year. And for Jesus to again repeat it in verse 14, this sentence was repeated again in verse 14. It must be something very important. So, it is both strange and important. It is both strange and important. Strange because if you and I were to search the whole Bible, the New and the Old Testament, we will never find any record of Jesus returning to Hebron in human form or in a vision. There was no record, but he repeated it twice. So the next question we have to ask is, what is so important about this sentence? What does it really mean? Firstly, we have to remember that Isaac, together with many other godly men in the Bible, they were types of Christ, meaning each of them would reveal certain or some characteristics of Jesus. That's why they are called types of Christ. So with the birth of Isaac, Jesus did return to Abraham and Sarah, because Isaac, being a type of Jesus, points to both the miraculous birth of Jesus and the sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross. And this will become clearer when we get to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22, when most of you would know where Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac. We'll get there someday. But our passage today is about God's plan for Sarah. God's plan for Sarah. Her very important role to bear the promised son. Because Isaac is to continue on from where Abraham left off. Isaac is to be the next part in God's redemption plan for the whole world. So this is very important. That's why Jesus had to come to personally deliver this message to Sarah. We go back to our first question at the beginning. We asked the all-important question, is God want to use Sarah? The all-important question is Sarah ready? Is she ready to be used by God? Is the flesh in Sarah, has it died? Has the old man in her died? Or is she still trying to do God's work in her own strength? Verse 11 tells us that both Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So at this point, Abraham was about 99, Sarah was 89. 89. Now, don't let that fool you, because even at 89, she wasn't haggard looking, wrinkled all over. No. Instead, Sarah was still very beautiful. She was not just charming, but she was very desirable. In today's term, we probably call it attractive or even hot. When she walks down Orchard Road, there'll be a lot of whistles. And this is something which we will find out later on in chapter 20, that it is true, Sarah was still very, very desirable. But Sarah has not forgotten that her earlier plan has failed. And for the past 12 to 13 years, Hagar and Ishmael were there to remind her of that failure. Every day she wakes up, she looks at Ishmael, and she's reminded of the bungle that she has made. But right now, when she heard the news that she's going to be a mother, verse 12 tells us, so Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, after I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure? Now, in the Young's literal translation, it reads, and Sarah laughed in her heart. I think this is exactly what happens. She laughed to herself, meaning she laughed in her heart. And as she laughed, she had this question, this thought. Now that I'm worn out, am I going to be a mother? And Abraham is an old man in her advanced age. Can it even be possible that I'm given this joy to experience motherhood at all. That was a question. And there are a lot of commentators who made a big deal out of all this. And the question is, did she laugh out of unbelief or mockery? When we laugh, it is one of these two, or joy. Unbelief, meaning you say, if I were to tell all of you, I'm going to give you each 100,000 by end of this month, each of you will have 100,000 in your bank account. All of you would fall off your chair and say, "You're kidding. You don't even have a 10,000 in your own bank account," which is true. So unbelief or mockery. Somebody said, "I'm going to be the next Olympic swimming champ," and you look at him and say, "Sure, right?" Or it could be out of joy. But I don't think it is out of unbelief or mockery or even joy. But it is out of disbelief. Disbelief. So you may ask, what is disbelief? Disbelief is saying that something is possible, but not probable. Something is possible, but not probable. So today, if I were to tell you, I'm going to take part in the next Olympic golf tournament representing Singapore, is it possible? Come on, tell me, is it possible for me, John Tan, to represent Singapore in the golf tournament at the Olympic level? Is it possible? Come on, give me some credit. Say yes. Yes, but it's not probable. It is unlikely. It is very, very, very difficult. All right. So this is exactly what happens here with Sarah. When she laughed, she was simply saying, "This is something just too good to be true. I cannot believe it that it is happening to me." But she said, it is going to be very difficult. How do we know? Because the next verse tells us, Jesus himself says, ask the question, is anything too difficult for God? Because in her heart, in her mind, that was how Sarah was thinking. Now, again, I think this is something which all of us can relate with. There were many moments in our own lives that the goodness of God just bowled us over, isn't it? Just floored us, and we'll just simply laugh out of disbelief. Having laughed, having thought that it is going to be difficult, Sarah made a very, very important confession. She said, "I'm already worn out." She acknowledged, she admitted that she was worn out. And the word worn out in Hebrew, the word worn out means to fail. And also, I think some of the other words were pretty good. Decay, spent. That means used up. Now it is wasted. Now then, people, when they come up to me, often they will lie to me. They say, "Oh, John, you are looking so good." And how do I usually respond? "No, I'm completely rotten, decaying on the inside, all needing overhaul, but cannot find spare parts. That's all." So this is exactly what she was saying, that she's decayed, spent, and wasted. Like a battery. When a battery is flat, what do? You throw it away. There's no more use for it. But notice something strange again happened in the next verse. Jesus asked Abraham, verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I'm old?'" I thought that it was a strange question for Jesus to ask Abraham because Abraham couldn't have heard Sarah laughing in her heart. It was in her heart. Much less to be able to read her mind when she said, "Will I really have a child now that I'm old?" But the good part is that Jesus wasn't expecting an answer from Abraham. But Jesus was only telling Abraham, "I am God." I heard her laughing in her heart, and I saw what she was thinking in her head. That Sarah was wondering. She was wondering, not doubting, not unbelief, but just wondering if she can even physically conceive and then carry the fetus to full term. She was just wondering. So here we find Jesus not only revealing to Abraham what was on Sarah's mind and telling Abraham, "I am God," but he went on in verse 14 to reassure them. To reassure them. In verse 14, is anything too hard for the Lord? The answer is no. Nothing is too difficult for God. And then he repeated that sentence again. "I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." That was the promise. And these words being repeated were meant to to strengthen their faith in the promises of God that God made in the covenant. And really, I think that it was at this point in time that both Abraham and Sarah suddenly realized that they were in the presence of the Holy God. And verse 15 tells us Sarah was afraid. So she lied and said, "I did not lie." She probably shouted through the tent door, "I did not lie." Notice the last statement that Jesus made. But he said, "Yes, you did lie." Did Sarah lie? The answer is yes. She lied. Why did she lie? She lied because the Bible tells us she was afraid. Afraid. She panicked, thinking that she did something wrong. But the best part is this, that Jesus didn't come all the way from heaven just to expose Sarah as a liar. Did he come to prove a point? And this is what most Bible commentators were making. But I don't think so. That Jesus did not come all the way from heaven just to prove that Sarah was a liar. No. And I'm certain that like Sarah, all of us, we lie every day. We lie every day. And some of you may not like this. You may say, "Pastor John, maybe you, but I don't." Do you, when you meet somebody, do you say, "How are you?" Do you say that? Maybe you don't say in those words. You say hello. Hello is a shortened form for "how are you?" Or you say hi. Hi is a shortened form for hello. Hello is a shortened form for "how are you?" And when you ask somebody, "How are you?" Is that a question? It is a question. And usually, when you ask somebody, "How are you?" it means that what? You are interested to know how are they. And if they are in a bad shape, then what would you do? You're obligated to help because you ask. But many times we say, "How are you?" And then we just walk away. We don't even wait for the answer, don't we? The Chinese, we have a way of asking, oh, have you had your dinner? Have you eaten? And we don't mean it. Because when you say, have you eaten? If the other party says no, then you're obligated to feed him. But you have no intention of feeding him. You have no interest in how the other person fares. And I hate it when somebody comes up to me and says, how are you? And then he walks past me. And I go, you want to know how am I? Why don't you wait for a minute and I'll tell you how I am. Are there also other times when we say, good to see you, good to see you? Is that true? Maybe it's true for some of you, but many times we don't even mean it, right? Somebody we hate to see, but we're just got to say, good to see you. Or times when we say, hey, we got to meet up for lunch. But it's not going to happen because I've got no intention of having lunch with you, right? That's a lie. So we lie every day. Not that it's a big deal or not a big deal. But that's not the point that Jesus was trying to make here. What then was the point that Jesus was trying to make? And it is this. Jesus personally came to Hebron to confirm to Sarah that the old man in her has died. The old man in her has died. When she made the confession, worn out, she said, I'm totally worn out. I give up. I'm spent. I'm dead. And when Jesus, in the last few words, Jesus said, yes, you did laugh. It was not with a tone of condemnation, but I think it was a very happy yes. Jesus was saying, yes, you laughed. Yes, you died. I think that was what Jesus was trying to bring across to us. That Sarah has died laughing. Question is, what about you? Has the old man in you died? You're saved. You're going to go to heaven. That's true. But in the meantime, the old man in us must be cut off. The flesh must be cut off. We must kill the old man in us. The old habits, the old sins in us, it is still controlling us. And it must die before God can use us in a big way. And He wants to. Unlike Sarah, who died laughing, many of us, our old men, will die when we are crying. Because Sarah came from a wealthy family. She had everything she needed. But it is a crisis that gets to all of us when our health are touched, when our money, our finances, our jobs are touched, when our family ones are touched. That's the time when we will die. And I hope that you and I, we will be able to say, like Sarah, I'm worn out. Lord, use me. God bless.
Thank you, Pastor John. For our last song, it's a new song called